One day you will not be there. The door that opens every morning at 7 will stay closed. The feeder that has been filled every day for 3 years, or 5 years, or 10, will go empty and stay empty. The footsteps on the porch that every bird in your yard has memorized, that they have built their mornings around, that have become as reliable and expected as the sunrise itself, those footsteps will stop. And the birds will wait. Not forever, but for longer than you might expect. And in ways that the science of avian memory and behavior can now describe with a specificity that I think most people have never been told, and that I believe most people would want to know. I am not making this video to be morbid. I am making it because I think the people who love their birds the most, who have spent years building something real with the wildlife outside their windows, deserve to understand what that something actually is. What it costs the birds to build it, what it means to them, and what happens to it when you are gone. Welcome back to Backyard Birds Whisper. Subscribe before you leave because what you are about to hear will change what every morning at the feeder means, starting tomorrow morning. Stay until the very end, because the final section is not about loss at all. It is about what you leave behind. And it is, I think, one of the most quietly extraordinary things I have ever had the chance to tell anyone. Let me take you through what actually happens. Not what we imagine happens, but what decades of behavioral science suggest happens when a person who has been a constant, reliable part of a bird's world suddenly stops appearing. On the first morning, the birds arrive exactly as they always have. The chickadee that has visited at 6:45 for the past 2 years arrives at 6:45. The cardinal pair that usually comes in the middle of the morning appears right on schedule. They find the feeder empty. They pause, looking toward the place where you should have been. They check the ground beneath it. They leave, only to return again a little later, just as birds do when a dependable food source is unexpectedly missing. But hunger is only part of the story. 4 birds that had learned your routine, your presence had become part of the landscape itself. Through hundreds of quiet encounters, they had built a simple expectation. At a certain time, in a certain place, the familiar human would appear. And so, even with no seed waiting for them, many of those same behaviors continue. The chickadee pauses and looks toward the back door. The cardinal lands on the branch where it often watched you refill the feeder. Their brains are not mourning in the human sense. They are following a pattern that experience has taught them is worth checking one more time. Behavioral observations suggest that birds often continue returning to the exact places where a familiar caretaker regularly appeared, even after that routine has been interrupted. They are not making a mistake. They are relying on a world that has always been predictable. For a few mornings, the old routine stays alive. The branch where you used to stand still matters. The sound of the door still matters. The path from the house still matters. And the birds keep arriving, expecting the world to work the way it always has. They do not know that the story has changed. So, on that first morning, your birds will come back to the places you once occupied. They will wait for a moment. They will look toward the doorway. And then, when nothing happens, they will fly away, only to return again later, hoping that the familiar figure who was always there might appear one more time. Over the first week, the yard begins to change. Not visibly. Not in any way that a neighbor walking past would notice. But in the behavior of the birds that lived there, something is shifting. The foraging routes reorganize. The time that was allocated to your feeder, a fixed, reliable, high-value resource around which the daily energy budget was structured, gets redistributed. The birds don't stop visiting the location, but the visits become shorter, less settled, more checking and less eating. The feeder was not just a food source. It was an anchor point, and an anchor point without its anchor becomes just another location. The acoustic landscape of the yard changes too. The contact calls, the soft, conversational sounds that mean everything is fine, carry on, that birds produce most freely in the presence of a trusted, familiar human, become less frequent. Not because the yard is less safe, but because the specific signal that was associated with your presence, the sound of your door, your footsteps, your voice if you talk to them, is no longer arriving. And the absence of an expected signal is itself a kind of signal. It tells the birds that something in their model of the world has changed. By day 5 or 6, The dominant male birds in your yard have begun the process of reasserting territorial boundaries that your presence had, in subtle ways, been moderating. Your yard had a social structure that was partly organized around you. Without you, that structure has to find a new equilibrium. There is more conflict at the feeder, more displacement, more of the social negotiation that happens in bird communities when a stabilizing element is removed. None of this is dramatic. None of it is visible to the casual eye. But it is real. Your presence had consequences. Your absence has consequences. The yard that you built over years of daily showing up is not the same yard after you are gone. It is working to become something new. And the working is uncomfortable. Here is the question that I think matters most. And I want to give it the careful answer it deserves. How long do birds remember a specific person? The honest answer is that we do not have precise measurements for every species. Bird memory research has advanced enormously in the last 2 decades, but long-term studies that track individual bird responses to specific absent humans over extended periods are difficult to design and expensive to conduct. What we have is a body of evidence from which reasonable inferences can be drawn. What we know about corvid memory, crows and jays, is that individual human recognition persists for years. Studies at the University of Washington documented crows maintaining specific behavioral responses to individual humans, avoidance of threatening individuals, comfort with trusted ones, for periods of up to 5 years and beyond. The facial recognition and associated behavioral programming appeared stable across long periods of time, through seasonal changes, through the bird's own life events including breeding cycles and territory shifts. For smaller songbirds, the cardinals and chickadees and robins most likely to be in your yard, the research is less extensive. But what exists suggests that learned associations with specific individuals, particularly associations tied to reliable food sources and repeated positive interactions, are among the most stable memories in the avian brain. They are reinforced daily. They are tied to survival. They do not fade quickly. What this means is that a cardinal that has been coming to your yard for 3 years carries a model of you that is deeply encoded, specific, stable, not easily overwritten. If that cardinal survives for another 2 or 3 years after you are gone, and cardinals can live that long in the wild, it will carry some version of that model for the rest of its life. Not consciously, not in grief, but in the structure of its behavior, in the slight hesitation it might show at a new feeder, in the particular way it responds to a person who moves and sounds something like you did. You will be in that bird's brain for years after you are gone. Not as a memory in the human sense, but as a shape, a pattern, a way of being in the world that was built partly around you and that does not simply disappear when you do. There is something else. Something beyond the individual birds and their individual memories. Something that operates at the level of the yard itself, of the ecological and behavioral community that you built, whether you knew you were building it or not. A yard that has had consistent feeding for years is not the same as a yard that has never been fed. The species composition is different. The population density of certain species is higher. The birds that nested there, that raised young there, that established their territories around the reliable resource you provided, those birds produced offspring. And those offspring grew up in a yard that was, from their first days, shaped by what you had built. The young cardinal that fledged in your oak tree last summer learned to find food partly by following its parents to your feeder. Your feeder is in its memory now. Not because it knew you, but because you were part of the landscape its parents navigated. You are in its model of the world as a location, as a resource type, as part of what a good territory looks like. When you are gone, that young cardinal will still know that a feeder in a yard like yours is worth seeking. It will carry that knowledge into its own territory establishment, its own mate selection, its own breeding decisions. The behavior you seeded, literally, continues forward in the birds that came after the ones that knew you directly. Researchers studying the multi-generational effects of supplemental feeding on bird populations have found that yards with long histories of consistent feeding show persistent differences in bird community composition for years after feeding stops. The ecological effect of what you built outlasts the immediate presence of what you built it with. You change the birds in your yard, And the birds in your yard changed the birds that came after them. Your consistency rippled forward in ways that are now, in the most literal biological sense, beyond your ability to see or measure. I want to speak to 3 different situations. Because leaving forever means different things to different people watching this. And each situation deserves its own honest acknowledgement. Number 1. If you are moving, if a new house, a new city, a life change is taking you away from the yard you have built, the birds you leave behind will adapt. The feeder will go empty. The route will reorganize. A new family will move in, and some of them may feed the birds, and the birds will gradually transfer their associations to the new presence. The transition will be harder than the new family realizes. The birds will be warier than they would be with a truly fresh start, because a trusted presence disappearing is different from no trusted presence having been there. But the yard will recover. New relationships will form. The birds will be okay. What you carry with you is the knowledge of what you built and the right to build it again in the new yard, with new birds who will come to know you the same way these ones did. Number 2. If illness or age or circumstance has taken you away from the yard, if you are watching this from somewhere that is not the yard you built, knowing you may not get back to it, I want you to know something. The birds you fed are still there. The cardinal that came every morning is still coming to the spot where the feeder was, or to the feeder if someone else has kept it filled. It is still running the route that your consistency created. Your influence on that bird's life did not end when yours changed. It is still there, in the structure of its days, in the safety it has learned to feel in a yard like the one you made. You did that. It is still doing what you made possible. Number 3. And for those of you watching this who are thinking about someone who is gone, a parent, a partner, a friend, whose feeder is now empty or whose yard has gone quiet, I want to say this as plainly as I can. The relationship that person had with their birds was real. The birds knew them. Specifically, individually, in the full neurological sense of individual recognition. Those birds carry something of that person in their behavior right now, today, whether anyone is filling the feeder or not. The love that person put into those mornings, the consistency, the care, the quiet daily act of showing up for something that could not say thank you, it is encoded in the birds that received it. It did not disappear. It changed form. It is still there, in the yard, in the birds, in the way the cardinal still looks toward the door. I want to give you something practical before we end, because I think this video could easily leave you feeling heavy, and that is not what it is for. What this video is for is this: to make you understand, while you still have the time, what you are building. So that you build it consciously. So that you show up for it fully. So that on the ordinary mornings, the cold ones, the busy ones, the ones when filling the feeder feels like a chore, you remember what you are actually doing. You are building a relationship with a wild animal that owes you nothing and chose you anyway. That looked at everything available to it and decided that your yard, your presence, your reliable showing up was worth orienting its life around. That extended to you, across the enormous distance between its world and yours, something that functions in every meaningful way like trust. Here is what you can do right now, today, that will matter after you are gone. Keep the feeder filled. Not because the birds cannot survive without it, many can, but because the consistency of your filling it is part of what the relationship is made of. Every morning you fill it is another data point in the bird's model of you. Another reinforcement of the association between you and safety and reliability. Another morning that the bird will remember in whatever way birds remember. Make a plan for the feeder. Tell someone, a neighbor, a family member, whoever will have access to your yard, that the feeder matters. That there are birds that depend on it. That if something happens to you, the feeder should keep being filled. Not indefinitely, but long enough for the birds to transition. For the routes to reorganize. For the adaptation to happen in a way that doesn't leave them stranded in the gap between what they expected and what is now true. And go outside tomorrow morning. Not because of anything in this video. Just because it is a morning and your birds are there, and the time you have with them is not unlimited, and you already know that. I want to end with something I have been thinking about for a long time. And I want to say it as carefully as I can, because I think it deserves care. Most of what we do in this life leaves no lasting mark. The conversations we have, the meals we cook, the routines we keep, they matter to the people and the moments they belong to, and then they are over. The world does not carry them forward. But the birds carry you forward. Not as a memory, not as a story, but in the structure of their behavior. In the territory they established around your yard. In the young they raised, in the safety your feeder created. In the generations of birds that came after the ones that knew you, who found your yard in their ranging and recognized it as a place that was shaped by someone who cared, even if they never knew who that someone was. The cardinal that comes to your feeder tomorrow morning is not the first cardinal to know your yard. It is the latest in a line of birds whose lives were shaped, in ways large and small, by what you built there. And the cardinal that comes to that yard 5 years after you are gone will be shaped by what that cardinal built, which was built on what you gave it. This is not sentiment. This is ecology. This is how the natural world carries the effects of care forward through time, in the bodies and behaviors of the creatures that received it. You are going to leave a mark on the birds in your yard that will outlast you. Not your name, not your face, not anything that can be pointed to or measured, but something real. Something that lives in the shortened flight distances and the established territories and the foraging routes that were built around the fact of you. You have been leaving that mark every morning, every seed, every quiet moment at the window, every time you went outside in the cold because the feeder was empty and the birds were waiting. That is your legacy in their world. It is already written. It is already there. And it will keep being there, in the birds and in the birds after the birds, long after the last morning you stand at the feeder. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life who built something like this with birds? A parent, a grandparent, someone whose feeder you now tend, whose yard you are trying to keep alive. Tell me about them. Tell me about the birds they left behind. This community holds those stories with more care than anywhere else I know. And every one of them deserves to be told. If this video made you think of someone, share it with the people who love them. Or share it for them. Because sometimes the right words at the right moment are exactly what grief needs to find its way towards something like peace. Thank you for being here at Backyard Birds Whisper. I'll see you in the next one.